A boy stands on the deck of a ship with nothing in his pockets but salt air and fear. Behind him, Scotland, cold stone, and a childhood that can't feed him. Ahead, Australia, so far away it might as well be another planet. He's not sailing toward adventure. He's sailing toward a deadline. Because if he doesn't become useful fast, he won't just fail, he'll disappear. And the strangest part? This boy will grow up to argue his way into history, not with a sword, not with a fortune, but with a voice sharp enough to cut through a room full of powerful men. George Houston Reid is born on 25 February 1845 in Johnstone, Renfrewshire, Scotland, into a world that offers working families very few second chances. His father, a minister, is a man of words and duty. His mother carries the quiet weight of keeping a household upright when money and certainty wobble. The mid-19th century is not kind to the poor, and it is not patient with the young. In Britain, the air itself seems heavy with soot and hierarchy. If you are born without land, without title, without connections, you learn early that the future is something you must wrestle into existence. Then comes the move that changes everything. The family emigrates to Australia. The voyage is long, the kind of journey that turns days into a blur of creaking timber and endless horizon. For a child, it's a floating world where you can't run away from your own thoughts. For the adults, it's a gamble with no refund. When they arrive in Sydney, the city is still rough-edged, still building itself, still full of people who have come to start over, and people who have come because they had no choice. Reid grows up in a colony where ambition is common, but security is rare. He is bright, observant, and already learning the most important skill of his life, how to speak so people listen. Not just listen, shift in their seats, frown, laugh, argue back. He studies, he reads, he absorbs the rhythms of debate. But talent doesn't pay rent. He needs a profession, a ladder, something solid under his feet. He chooses the law. It's a choice that sounds respectable, even safe, until you remember what it means in a young colony. Long hours, fierce competition. Yes, in the constant pressure to prove you belong among men who already have clients, reputations, and family names that open doors. Reid qualifies as a barrister. He begins to build a practice, and here the first real shape of his future appears. He is not merely a lawyer who knows statutes. He is a lawyer who understands people, how they justify themselves, how they hide, how they perform innocence or certainty. He learns to dismantle an argument piece by piece, calmly, almost cheerfully, until the other side realizes they've been walking on a floor that isn't there. But the law is only half the story. The other half is the hunger to influence the rules themselves. New South Wales politics in the late 19th century is loud, personal, and often brutal. It's a place where reputations are made in newspapers and destroyed in Parliament, where alliances shift, where the public mood can turn like weather. Reid watches it closely. He sees that power is not only held by those with wealth, it can be seized by those who can persuade. And persuasion for him is not a trick. It's a craft. He enters public life and quickly becomes known for something that is both a gift and a weapon. Wit. Not gentle wit, not polite dinner table humor. His is the kind that can puncture a pompous speech in a single line. The kind that makes supporters roar and opponents flush with anger. In an era when politics can be stiff with self-importance, Reid's humor is dynamite. It makes him memorable. It makes him dangerous. Yet beneath the jokes is a serious mind. Reid is a liberal in the old sense. He believes in individual freedom, in responsible government, in reform that doesn't burn the house down but does not pretend the house is fine. He is drawn to questions that touch ordinary lives: taxation, trade, the machinery of government. He is not content to be a spectator. As he rises, he meets the first version of the enemy that will define him. Not a single man, but a system of expectations. The colony's political class has its own rules. Who is suitable? Who is serious? Who is allowed to lead? Reid is clever, yes, but he is also an outsider in style and temperament. He doesn't always sound like the men who think they were born to govern. He doesn't always behave like them either. He laughs too easily. He attacks too sharply. He refuses to be intimidated by tradition. That refusal earns him attention and resistance. In Parliament, he becomes a figure people cannot ignore. He speaks with force, with clarity, with a rhythm that feels less like a lecture and more like a duel. He can be charming one moment and merciless the next. He can turn a technical issue into a moral question, then flip it back into numbers and consequences. He is building a reputation not just as a performer, but as a strategist. And then comes the issue that begins to swallow Australian politics whole: federation. The idea is simple to say and hard to do. Unite the separate colonies into one nation. But every simple part hides a trap. Who controls what? How are states represented? What happens to tariffs? To trade? To local power? To identity? Federation is not merely a constitutional project. It is a fight over the future, and everyone knows it. Reid steps into this fight with a mind trained by law and sharpened by politics. He is not a blind romantic about unity. He is cautious, analytical, sometimes maddeningly so to those who want a clean, emotional yes. He wants the details. He wants safeguards. He wants to know exactly what is being built before he agrees to live inside it. That caution becomes his burden. Because in politics, hesitation can look like weakness. Nuance can look like betrayal. And Reid's opponents, both ideological and personal, begin to paint him as the man who won't commit. The man who talks too much. The man who hides behind cleverness. The nickname that will haunt him later is already forming in the public imagination. Yes, no, Reid. Suresh Tajuri, a man who seems to stand with one foot on each side of history. But Reid is not drifting. He is calculating. He understands that a nation built in haste can crack under pressure. He also understands something darker. Once federation happens, there is no going back. This is not a bill you can amend next year. It is a door that locks behind you. And while the public debate grows hotter, Reid's personal clock is ticking in a different way. Politics is not a hobby. It is a consuming, exhausting life. Every speech is judged. Every compromise is remembered. Every mistake is printed. He has to keep his career alive, his credibility intact, his party together, and his family life from collapsing under the weight of constant public scrutiny. There is no pause button. There is only the next session, the next headline, the next vote. He becomes a central figure in New South Wales Liberal politics, and the stakes rise. The colony is wrestling with economic questions that cut deep. How to raise revenue, how to balance competing interests, how to manage the tension between free trade and protection. Reid's instincts pull him toward free trade, toward opening markets, toward resisting policies that he believes will make the public pay more for the benefit of a few. But every economic stance creates enemies. Every enemy looks for a weakness, and Reid gives them one. He is too visible. He is the man who speaks, the man who jokes, the man who argues, the man who refuses to be quiet. In a political culture that often rewards blandness, Reid is a flare in the night sky. You can't miss him, and you can't stop looking at him. As his influence grows, so does the pressure to prove he is more than a brilliant talker. He needs executive power. He needs a chance to show he can govern, not just debate. And the path to that power is narrow, crowded, and lined with rivals who would rather see him stumble than succeed. The colony is changing. Australia is changing. The old world is fading. The new one is not yet formed. And Reid is standing in the middle of the storm with a lawyer's mind and a performer's voice. He has escaped the limits of his birth, crossed an ocean, climbed into the arena, and now the arena is demanding a price. Because the closer he gets to real power, the less forgiving the game becomes. The jokes have to land. The numbers have to add up. The alliances have to hold. And the federation question, this massive, irreversible decision, keeps looming like a shadow over every other issue. Reid is approaching the moment when he will have to stop being the man who can argue both sides and become the man who chooses. And once he chooses, half the country will call him a traitor, the other half will call him too late, and the clock that started ticking on that ship from Scotland will sound louder than ever. He came to Australia as a child with no guarantee of survival. Now he is close enough to the center of power to feel its heat. And in the next stretch of his life, he won't just be judged by what he believes. He'll be judged by what he dares to do when the future demands an answer. The first time George Reid tastes real power, it isn't sweet. It's metallic, like biting down on a coin. Because power doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with a bill, and the bill is due immediately. New South Wales is restless, loud with argument, and hungry for certainty. The economy has been bruised by hard years. The public mood swings between anger and fear. In that atmosphere, Reid's greatest weapon, his voice, becomes a liability. Every sentence is a match. Strike it wrong, and the whole room goes up. He climbs anyway. By the early 1890s, Reid is no longer just a brilliant parliamentary duelist. He is a man being measured for the top job, whether he likes the measuring or not. He has built a reputation as a free trader, suspicious of tariffs, allergic to protectionist promises, convinced that the public should not be forced to pay higher prices to shelter favored industries. It's a clean philosophy in theory. In practice, it makes enemies in every corner where someone profits from a closed gate. And then in 1894, the gate swings open. Reid becomes Premier of New South Wales. The title sounds like triumph. The reality is a trap door, because the moment he takes office, the colony's problems stop being topics for debate and become fires on his desk. Fires that don't care how clever he is. He inherits a government that must look stable while standing on shifting sand. Parliament is fragmented, loyalties are conditional, newspapers are eager to smell blood. Reid's opponents don't just want him defeated, they want him exposed as what they've always accused him of being, a performer who can govern. So he does the one thing that shocks them: he governs. Not with grand romantic speeches, but with the cold, practical machinery of reform. He pushes for changes in public administration and finance. And he does it with the instincts of a lawyer who knows where the loopholes hide. He is determined to make government less of a private club and more of a working instrument. That sounds noble until you remember that every instrument has hands on it, and those hands don't like being pried off. His most explosive move is aimed straight at the heart of privilege: land. In New South Wales, land is not just property. It is power made visible. Fences, titles, and names that have been treated like destiny. Reid backs land and income taxation measures that threaten the comfortable assumption that the wealthy can sit above the colony's burdens. It is the kind of policy that makes ordinary people lean forward and makes the powerful sit up straight. And the powerful do not sit up straight quietly. They fight him in Parliament. They fight him in the press. They fight him in the social world where reputations are traded like currency. Reid is mocked, attacked, and painted as reckless. He is told he is endangering investment, endangering stability, endangering the colony's future. The message is always the same: stop. But Reid has a different message, and he delivers it with that dangerous mix of humor and steel. He can turn a hostile chamber into an audience, and then turn the audience into a weapon. He makes his opponents look like men defending a locked pantry while the street outside is hungry. Still, the deeper he goes, the more he discovers the brutal truth of leadership. You can be right and still lose. Because while Reid is trying to reshape New South Wales, another storm is swallowing everything: federation. The question is no longer theoretical. It is no longer a debating society's dream. It is becoming a deadline. Across the colonies, the push to unite is accelerating. Meetings, conventions, drafts, counterdrafts. Australia is trying to write itself into existence. And Reid, now Premier, is trapped in the worst possible position. He cannot ignore federation, but he also cannot surrender New South Wales' interest to a constitution he believes may be flawed. This is where his real conflict sharpens into something personal. It isn't just Reid versus another politician. It's Reid versus the momentum of history and the public's impatience with anyone who slows it down. He studies the proposed constitution like a barrister cross-examining a witness. He worries about the Senate's power, about the balance between large and small colonies, about financial arrangements that could punish New South Wales. He is not trying to kill federation, he insists. He is trying to stop Australia from building a house with cracks in the foundation. But nuance is a terrible campaign slogan. The federation movement wants a hero. It wants a clean yes. Reid keeps offering something more complicated. Yes, but, and in politics, but can sound like betrayal. The nickname that will cling to him, Yes, No Reid, starts to harden into a brand. It is repeated with laughter in pubs and with contempt in editorials. It is used to make him look slippery, untrustworthy, a man who can't commit. The cruel irony is that Reid is committing to caution, to detail, to the idea that a nation should not be stitched together with loose thread. Then comes the moment that turns his caution into theater. In 1898, Reid delivers a speech on federation that becomes infamous. It is long, intricate, and razor-edged. An argument that seems to hold the Constitution up to the light and point out every flaw, every shadow, every risk. And yet, at the end, he does not slam the door. He does not declare war on federation. He leaves it open, conditionally. To his supporters, it is responsible leadership. To his enemies, it is proof of everything they've said. He wants to have it both ways. And now the clock starts ticking louder than ever, because the federation referendums are coming. The public will vote. The colonies will decide. Reid is premier of the largest colony, and his stance could tilt the entire project. He tries to negotiate improvements, especially on financial terms, because he knows that if New South Wales feels cheated, Federation will be born with resentment in its lungs. He pushes, bargains, pressures. He is not merely debating, he is trying to rewrite the deal before the ink dries. But history is not patient with negotiators. The first referendum in New South Wales in 1898 fails to reach the required threshold. The result is a shockwave. Federation supporters rage, opponents gloat, and Reid is blamed by both sides, one for being too critical, the other for not killing the project outright. It is the perfect political punishment, being attacked for opposite sins at the same time. And then comes the twist that makes his enemies blink. Reid does not retreat. He goes back into the fight, pushing for changes, and then, when the revised terms are on the table, he shifts. He supports the second referendum in 1899, not because he has become a romantic overnight, but because he has extracted enough to believe New South Wales can live with the bargain. He throws his weight behind a yes that is no longer vague. The referendum passes. For a moment it looks like Reid has threaded the needle, cautious enough to demand improvements, pragmatic enough to accept the final deal. But politics doesn't reward needlework. It rewards simple stories. And the simple story about Reid has already been written by his opponents. He hesitated, he wavered, he nearly derailed the nation. The Federation battle leaves scars. It also leaves him exposed. Because while Reid is wrestling with the Constitution, his government is still fighting on other fronts. Taxation, administration, the daily grind of keeping a colony running. The strain is constant. Every day is a negotiation with Parliament, with the press, with factions that smell weakness like sharks smell blood. And blood appears. By 1899, Reid's position as Premier collapses. The exact mechanics are parliamentary, procedural, almost boring on paper. But the feeling is not boring at all. It is the sensation of being dragged off a stage while the audience argues about whether you deserve the role in the first place. He is replaced, and the message from his enemies is clear. You can talk, George, but you can't hold the room forever. Except Reid is not built to leave quietly. He remains a central figure, and when Federation becomes reality, when the Commonwealth of Australia is finally proclaimed in 1901, the old colonial battleground is replaced by a new national arena. The stakes are higher, the audience larger, the consequences permanent. And Reid, who has spent years being accused of standing in the doorway of history, steps through it. He enters the first federal parliament as a leading figure of the free trade movement. The new nation is still wet cement. Parties are unstable, alliances fluid, and the rules of the game are being invented in real time. Reid sees an opportunity and a danger. If the protectionists dominate, he believes, Australia could lock itself into an economic posture that will make everything more expensive and less competitive. If the new parliament becomes a machine for favors, the Commonwealth will rot before it hardens. So he does what he has always done. He fights with words sharp enough to leave marks. His main rival now is not a single man, but a force, protectionism, and the political coalition forming around it. Yet faces matter in politics, and one face becomes impossible to ignore. Alfred Deakin. Deakin is brilliant, idealistic, and persuasive in a different way than Reid. Less cutting, more visionary. Where Reid dissects, Deakin inspires. Where Reid warns, Deakin promises. Australia is watching two kinds of leadership collide, and Reid knows something that makes the collision deadly. In a young nation, people often choose the story they want to believe, not the argument that is hardest to refute. In 1903, Reid's Free Trade Party is reshaped into something more aggressive, more explicitly anti-socialist, the Anti-Socialist Party. It is a strategic pivot, a recognition that the political landscape is changing fast. The Labour Party is rising, disciplined and growing, and it threatens to become the balance of power or the power itself. Reid understands that if non-Labour forces remain divided, Labour will walk through the middle and take the country. So he tries to forge a new alignment. He tries to pull the anti-Labour forces together. It is not a clean, noble project. It is politics as survival. And then in 1904, the impossible happens. George Reid becomes Prime Minister of Australia. Not for years, not for a comfortable era of dominance. For a brief, tense stretch, just long enough to taste the top and feel how thin the air is there. His government is a minority, dependent on shifting support, vulnerable to every parliamentary ambush. The clock is not just ticking now, it is screaming. He has to prove himself fast because in the new Commonwealth, governments can fall like a man slipping on wet stone. Reid tries to hold the line against protectionist dominance, against socialist expansion, against a parliament that seems designed to produce instability. He pushes for an election, seeking a clearer mandate. He wants the country to choose, to stop living in constant compromise. But the country is not ready to give him what he wants. In 1905, his government falls. Deakin returns, Reid is out. And here is the cruelest visual of all. The man who helped shape the terms under which New South Wales entered federation, the man who fought to refine the Constitution, the man who briefly held the highest office in the land, now watches as the political world begins to reorganize without him at the center. Yet he is not finished, not even close, because Reid's real deadline is not just electoral. It is historical. The new party system is hardening. Labor is rising. Anti-labor forces are moving toward fusion. If Reid cannot adapt, he will become a relic while still alive, a famous voice echoing in a room that has moved on. And Reid, who has spent his life refusing to be dismissed, prepares for his next move, one that will take him away from Australian domestic politics and into the wider empire, where the battles are different, the stakes global, and the cost of being underestimated can be even higher. The first time George Reid loses the prime ministership, it doesn't look like a tragedy. No riots, no gunshots, no dramatic resignation on a stormy balcony. Just a vote, a shift of numbers, a quiet walk out of the center of the frame. But that's the trick of Reid's story. The most dangerous moments rarely arrive with thunder. They arrive with a calendar. Because after 1905, time turns into his real enemy. The new Commonwealth is hardening fast. Parties, loyalties, the very language of politics. If Reid can't force the country to choose a side before the shape sets, he won't just lose office. He'll lose the argument for the kind of Australia he believes in. And he can feel it happening. In the first federal parliament, everything is still wet cement. Governments fall quickly, alliances are temporary, and every leader is trying to convince the public that their version of the nation is the one that should solidify. Reid's version is blunt. Keep trade freer, keep government from becoming a machine for favors, and don't let tariffs quietly tax the poor to protect the powerful. It's not a romantic vision. It's a ledger book vision, and ledger book visions don't sing unless you have Reid's voice. So he keeps fighting. He sits across from Alfred Deakin, brilliant, persuasive, almost luminous in comparison. And Reid understands the problem immediately. Deakin can make people feel proud of an idea. Reid can make people understand the cost of it. In a young country, pride often beats cost. Reid's speeches become sharper, funnier, more surgical, because he knows he's competing not just with policies, but with a story the public wants to hear. And then there's labor. Labor is disciplined in a way the older factions aren't. It votes together. It negotiates as a bloc. It grows like a tide. Reid watches it and realizes something that makes his stomach tighten. The old game of loose alliances is ending. The new game is organization. If the non-labor forces stay split, free traders on one side, protectionists on the other, labor will keep holding the balance of power. And eventually it won't just balance, it will rule. That's why Reid's pivot is so aggressive. He doesn't merely defend free trade anymore. He reframes the battlefield. He turns his party into the anti-socialist party, not because he suddenly wakes up craving slogans, but because he's trying to build a wall before the flood reaches the foundations. It's a gamble. He's betting that fear of socialism will unite people who can't agree on tariffs. The gamble works partly. It also poisons the air. Because once you name the enemy, you can't easily go back to polite disagreement. Reid's rhetoric becomes a weapon designed to force a binary choice. You're either with him against socialism, or you're helping it. It's effective. It's also exhausting. And it makes him more enemies than friends in a parliament already full of knives. Still, Reid is not a man who waits for permission. He pushes for an election in 1906, trying to turn the chaos of minority government into a clear mandate. He wants the country to stop drifting. He wants the voters to decide what kind of economy they're building, what kind of state they're funding, what kind of future they're buying. The result is not the clean victory he needs. The numbers shift, but not enough. The parliament remains a puzzle with missing pieces. And behind the scenes, the real transformation begins, the one that will decide Reid's fate. The anti-labor forces start moving toward each other. The idea is simple and brutal. Fuse or die. Protectionists and anti-socialists, men who have spent years calling each other reckless, selfish, deluded, begin to consider standing together just to keep labor out. It's not a marriage of love, it's a marriage of fear. Reid sees the shape of it before it fully forms, and it hits him like a cold splash. If fusion happens, his old identity as the champion of free trade becomes less valuable. The new coalition won't be built around his economic purity. It will be built around a single purpose: stop labor. And in that world, Reid is useful only if he can be controlled. He tries to steer it. He tries to be the architect, not the brick. But the momentum is bigger than him now. The country is changing its political skeleton, and Reid, who once dominated rooms with sheer force of personality, finds himself negotiating with a new kind of power, party machinery. In 1908 and 1909, the pressure becomes unbearable. The fusion finally happens, creating a new anti-labor force that will become the Liberal Party. It's the alignment Reid argued for in principle: unite the non-labor side. But it comes with a bitter twist. It's not his party anymore. It's not his banner. It's not his language. The center of gravity shifts toward Deacon and others who can sell unity without Reid's abrasiveness. Reid is still there, still loud, still capable of turning a phrase into a blade. But he can feel the room changing. The laughter lands differently. The applause is less certain. The younger men are not afraid of him in the way the old rivals were. They respect his talent, but they don't orbit it. And then the deadline tightens. Because Reid's health is not a rumor, it's a fact he carries in his body. He is a big man, and the strain of years, late nights, constant travel, relentless speaking, has consequences. He is not collapsing in public, not yet, but the cost is accumulating. He can't pretend he has endless time to reinvent himself inside a new political order. So he chooses the move that looks to some like retreat. In 1910, he leaves the Australian Parliament to become High Commissioner for Australia in London. On paper, it's an honor. In reality, it's exile with velvet curtains. London is the heart of the empire, a city that can make even a former prime minister feel like a provincial visitor. The streets are crowded with power, ministers, diplomats, financiers, men who have never heard the roar of an Australian election meeting and don't care to. Reid arrives with his booming voice and his instinct for combat, and he has to learn a new kind of fight, one where the weapons are. Dinners, memoranda, and private conversations that never make the newspapers. But Reid is not built to be decorative. As High Commissioner, he becomes Australia's advocate in the imperial capital, pushing for Australian interests, arguing for recognition, trying to ensure that the young Commonwealth is treated as more than a distant outpost. He works the networks, meets the decision-makers, and uses what he has always used: presence. When Reid enters a room, people notice. When he speaks, they listen, sometimes because they agree, sometimes because they can't look away. And then comes another twist. The man who spent years battling over Australia's independence of judgment now finds himself representing Australia inside the machinery of empire. It's a strange symmetry. Reid, the Federation skeptic turned Federation pragmatist, now stands in London as proof that Australia is both part of the imperial system and increasingly its own political creature. The job is demanding, and the world is not calm. The years before the First World War are thick with tension, alliances, naval races, the sense that Europe is a room full of gas and someone is playing with matches. Reid watches it from the center of the imperial web. He attends functions where the talk is polite and the implications are terrifying. He reads cables, hears rumors, feels the temperature rising. And when war finally comes in 1914, the stakes of his role change overnight. Australia is at war because Britain is at war. The connection is immediate, almost automatic, and Reid is in London as the human conduit of that connection. The conflict is no longer theoretical. It's ships, men, money, casualties. It's telegrams that arrive like punches. It's lists of names. It's the knowledge that decisions made in rooms he can enter will ripple all the way to farms and suburbs on the other side of the world. Reid throws himself into the work. He supports recruitment and the war effort, speaks at events, helps maintain the political and emotional link between Australia and Britain. He is not a general, not a strategist, but he is something the war also needs: a voice that can translate sacrifice into meaning, and meaning into continued commitment. Yet even here, time keeps collecting its debt. The strain of wartime London, its pressure, its pace, its constant sense of emergency, grinds at him. Reid is no longer the man who could dominate a colonial parliament by sheer stamina. He is older now, and the body that carried him through decades of combat begins to falter. The deadlines are no longer elections. They are medical. Still, he refuses to fade quietly. He keeps appearing, keeps speaking, keeps representing. There is something almost defiant in it, as if he believes that if he stops moving, history will close the door behind him and lock it. And then, in 1916, another marker of recognition arrives. He is made a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. The Empire pins a glittering symbol on a man who once fought so hard to shape Australia's place within and alongside that empire. It is both reward and irony. And Reid, who understands theater better than most, surely feels the weight of the moment. But honors don't slow the clock. By 1918, the war is nearing its end. But Reid is nearing his own. His health deteriorates. The work that once energized him now drains him. The voice that could slice through a chamber now has to be rationed. And in September in London, far from the Australian crowds that once heckled and cheered him, George Reid dies. The image is stark if you let it be. A man who helped argue a nation into existence, who briefly held its highest office, who fought to shape its political spine, ending his days not in the heat of Australian Parliament, but in the imperial capital, worn down by years and duty. And yet the story doesn't end with the quietness of that room. Because the battles Reid fought, over trade, over party structure, over the very idea of what the Commonwealth should become, did not die with him. They hardened into the system Australia would live inside for decades. The fusion he helped make inevitable became the foundation of modern non-labor politics. The disciplined rise of labor that he feared became a defining force. The arguments he made about costs, about power, about the danger of letting slogans replace scrutiny, those arguments kept resurfacing, sucking in new forms, in new crises, long after his own voice fell silent. Reid's life is often reduced to a nickname, a punchline, yes, no, Reid, as if complexity were a crime. But the truth is harsher and more interesting. He lived at the moment Australia stopped being an idea and became a machine, and he fought over the machine's design with everything he had. And machines once built keep running. If you want a clean ending, George Reid won't give you one, because the last years of his life don't resolve into a neat moral. They tighten, they narrow. They become a corridor with a door at the end. And Reid, who spent decades turning politics into a brawl you could hear from the street, walks that corridor in silence compared to the noise he once made. Picture it, London in wartime. Blackout curtains, coal smoke, telegrams that arrive like bullets. A former Prime Minister of Australia, once the loudest man in the room, now measuring his days by breath, by fatigue, by how long he can stand before the room tilts. The clock that used to be electoral is now biological, and it is not negotiable. Reid had come to London in 1910 as Australia's High Commissioner, a role that sounded ceremonial to people who didn't understand empire. But the High Commissioner wasn't a ribbon cutter. He was a hinge. He was the human joint between a young Commonwealth and the oldest power structure on Earth. And Reid, who had spent his career arguing that Australia should think for itself, now had to make Australia heard inside the imperial machine without being crushed by it. At first, he attacks the job the way he attacked everything, with appetite. He works rooms the way he once worked crowds. He cultivates ministers, editors, financiers, the men who could open doors or quietly close them. He writes, he negotiates, he presses. He is not content to be a colonial ornament. He wants outcomes, recognition, respect, leverage. He wants Australia treated as a partner, not a distant dependency that sends woolen suns. And then the world catches fire. When war breaks in 1914, London changes overnight. The city becomes a headquarters for catastrophe. The polite talk at dinners turns into casualty figures. The empire's arteries, shipping, finance, manpower, are suddenly life and death. And Reid's position, once important, becomes urgent. He is no longer just representing Australia's interests. He is helping hold together the emotional and political logic of Australia. His participation in a war decided half a world away. This is where the irony bites hardest. Reid had been the man who warned against easy slogans and automatic loyalties. He had mocked the lazy comfort of inherited assumptions. Yet now he is part of the apparatus that makes the connection between Britain and Australia feel inevitable. Not because he's a hypocrite, because history has shoved him into a role where the old arguments are no longer academic. The war doesn't ask whether you prefer free trade or protection. It asks how many men you can send, how much money you can raise, how long you can endure. Reid throws himself into the work anyway. He speaks at events. He supports recruitment. He becomes, in effect, a translator of sacrifice. turning distant battlefields into something the public can grasp, turning grief into resolve. He is not commanding armies, but he is helping to keep the chain of commitment from snapping. And the chain is heavy. Wartime London is not kind to the body. The pace is relentless, the stress constant, the air thick, the night short. Reid is in his late 60s when the war begins, and he has already spent a lifetime burning himself as fuel for politics. He had never been a man built for moderation. He had always been large, physically, vocally, emotionally, and that largeness had a cost. Now the cost comes due. The cruel part is that he can feel it. Reid is too intelligent not to notice the narrowing of his own capacity. The voice that once rolled through Parliament like thunder now has to be rationed. The stamina that once carried him through endless meetings and speeches begins to fail. He is still George Reid, still sharp, still capable of turning a phrase into a weapon, but the body that delivered the weapon is weakening, and yet he refuses to step aside. There is a particular kind of pride in that refusal, but also fear. Reid had spent his life in motion, debating, campaigning, fighting, building coalitions, tearing them apart, rebuilding them again. To stop moving would be to admit that the story is ending. And Reid has never liked letting anyone else write the last line. In 1916, the Empire gives him one of its highest diplomatic honors, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. It is a glittering symbol pinned onto a man who had once been treated as a colonial bruiser, a loud Australian with inconvenient questions. Now the same imperial system marks him as one of its distinguished servants. It is also, unmistakably, a kind of closing bracket. Honors often arrive when the work is nearly done, when the person is already being moved from the present into the past. Reid would have understood that. He understood theater. He understood timing. He understood that politics is not only power, it is also staging. And this was the empire staging its gratitude while it still could. But gratitude does not slow time. By 1918, the war is grinding toward its end, and Reid is grinding toward his own. His health deteriorates further. The strain that he has carried for years, stress, weight, exhaustion, the accumulated damage of a life lived at full volume, tightens around him. He is still in London, still far from the Australian crowds that once heckled him and cheered him, still far from the Parliament where he had fought to shape the Commonwealth's spine. And then on 12th September 1918, George Reid dies. The image is almost too stark. A man who helped argue a nation into existence, who briefly held its highest office, who fought to force Australia into a clearer political shape, ending not in the heat of Australian politics, but in the imperial capital, worn down by duty and years as the greatest war the world had seen was still not quite finished. If you're looking for a cinematic final scene, you might imagine a last speech, a last dramatic letter, a last defiant line. Real life is colder. Real life is a room, a failing body, and the quiet fact that the world keeps moving even when the voice stops. And yet Reid's story doesn't fade just because his lungs do, because what he fought over became the architecture Australia lived inside. The party system that hardened during his career, the very thing he sensed coming like a storm, did not soften after his death. It became the permanent weather. The fusion he helped make inevitable became the foundation of modern non-labor politics, a lineage that would evolve into the long-running liberal tradition. The labor movement he feared, disciplined and rising, did not collapse back into the margins. It became a defining force of government, shaping policy, identity, and the language of fairness and work for generations. Even his most mocked trait, his complexity, turned out to be prophetic. They called him Yes-No Reid, as if it were a joke about indecision. But the deeper truth is that Reid lived in a moment when Australia itself was a yes and a no at the same time. Yes to nationhood, and no to reckless romanticism. Yes to unity, no to surrendering scrutiny. Yes to progress, no to pretending progress is free. Reid's mind was built for that tension. He distrusted simple answers because he had watched simple answers become expensive. And that is his real legacy. Not a single policy, not a single office held, not a single victory you can frame and hang on a wall. It is the habit of asking relentlessly, who pays? And who benefits? When the room is drunk on slogans, Reid's opponents often outshone him in elegance. Deacon could make a nation feel noble. Reid could make a nation feel accountable. In the long run, both are necessary. Pride builds, scrutiny prevents rot. So when you hear his name now, Don't picture only the caricature, the booming voice, the jokes, the nickname. Picture the man at the hinge point of history, a Scottish-born immigrant who arrived in Australia as a boy, rose through law and parliament. He helped to steer a colony into a state, helped to steer states into a commonwealth, briefly led that commonwealth, then watched the political world he knew harden into something new and unforgiving. And in the end, picture the final contrast that makes his life sting. The man who fought to make Australia a nation dies far from it, yet the nation he helped shape keeps running, like a machine, long after the engineer is gone. Machines don't remember the hands that built them, but they carry the design,